The wind can ruin any disc golfer's round, and in today's podcast, two Kansas disc golfers who deal with the wind on a daily basis give you their top tips for how you can improve your game in the wind and therefore be getting more birdies and playing better against your friends. If you're just wanting to understand how does the wind impact the discs, what are the terms that these people are throwing out, this is a great episode for you, as well as we will break down how the wind impacts the discs, as well as our top tips for playing good in the wind. You're going to want to make sure you hit the subscribe button right now so you never miss out on these tips and many more as well. If you like this podcast and you want a bonus episode, make sure you go over to our Patreon, patreon.com/Chain Clankers, and check out this week's episode of Beyond the Chains. Let's get into today's episode right now. Alrighty, Trent, how are we doing tonight, man? Excited to talk about some windy discs and finally give some of our Kansas knowledge to everyone else?
Yes, I cannot wait, man. I am doing good. The kids went down kind of all right, so, we're just having us a good old night. Watched some Frozen 2 before bed. It's just been great.
Oh, you watched
How
Frozen
about yourself?
2? We were watching Cinderella.
Nice.
The new one,
the new one?
The non-anime one, the like live action one. It's actually pretty gas. I'm excited to go finish this thing. She just turned the pumpkin into the carriage. I'm pretty excited, not gonna lie. But I'm more excited to talk to you guys about playing disc golf in the wind and how you can dominate those windy rounds. Because for us folk in Kansas, this is something that is literally a way of life. I've talked to you, Trent, before about this. I've talked to Horatio about this. It's almost more difficult to play with no wind at all because you're used to having that 10 to 20 mile per hour wind that when there's no wind at all, you're like, why is my disc not flying the same? Because we've almost adapted to discs flying a certain way, building your bag a certain way. And so we want to share some of that knowledge with you guys because wind can be the great equalizer. You can be a 950 rated player, and as soon as you throw a little bit of wind in there, maybe you're an 850 rated player all of a sudden. We want to give you the confidence to continue to get those birdies and continue to play well in tournaments or just against your friends and get those bragging rights. So how we're going to structure this is we're going to kind of break this up into tips about driving, approaching, and putting. So you're going to get a tip from each of us on each aspect of the game, so that way you can take you can become a more well-rounded wind disc golfer. Trenton, start us off. What is the first tip, and what can players do when driving when there's heavy wind?
All right, so the first tip I'm going to talk to you guys about is throwing with the heavy wind. Yes, like Quentin was saying, sometimes you get used to playing, especially out here in Kansas, you get used to playing in that 15 to 25, 30 mile an hour winds, and it's just part of it. And when you get out there and it's 4 to 5 mile an hour wind, you don't really know what to do. Your discs fly a little bit different. But one thing I want to talk to you guys about, especially when you're throwing in the wind or with the wind, is your disc selection. Mainly, Quentin's going to touch a little bit on another part of it, obviously throwing against, or not obviously, but throwing into the wind and whatnot. So I'm going to talk to you about throwing with the wind and the disc selection you want to use. So normally, when you're throwing with the wind, you're going to want to grab an understable disc. Now, an understable disc is going to be your disc that flips over the most for you when you throw any kind of shot. Forehand, backhand, it's going to be the one that flips over, turns. If you're right hand, backhand, it's going to flip up and go to the right. If you're left hand, it's going to flip up and go to the left and then finish a little bit right, or sometimes even finish left if you're left-handed. But the point I'm trying to get at here is when you're throwing with the wind, the reason you want to throw an understable disc is because the disc is going to fly slower through the air. And sometimes that means you're going to want to throw, instead of throwing like a 12-speed destroyer like you normally throw, you're going to want to disc down. So you're going to want to go down to like a 7, 8, 9 fairway driver, maybe even a mid-range if it's that windy, because the disc is not going to get up to speed. So it's not going to do what it normally does when you normally throw the disc. So if you usually get an S-curve, when you're throwing with the wind, it is not going to do that. Even the most flippy disc you have. Say you have a Latitude 64 diamond, 155 gram diamond. Those are usually easy to throw, lightweight discs. And usually when you backhand that thing, it is the flippiest disc you've ever seen. Well, if you get out in a 20-mile-an-hour wind and you're throwing with it, you throw that thing and it's going to go, I almost guarantee it's going to go dead straight and it's going to just glide forever. And it's not going to flip over because it's not going to be moving as fast as it normally does when you are in normal conditions. You're not throwing with the wind. When you're throwing with the wind, understable discs, lower the speed down, grab your mids and fairways, don't grab your 12, 11 speeds, and you will see a lot more distance than if you throw your normal discs with a tailwind.
Exactly. So Trenton right there is talking about the tailwind if you're looking for the disc golf jargon right there. Throwing with the tailwind, you're throwing with the wind. You want to grab the understable discs in your bag, the slower speed discs in your bag. And I'm going to talk about the inverse. When you're throwing into the wind and when you're throwing into a headwind, what's happening is your disc is wanting to flip over and go to the right. So let's talk about maybe some understable discs, right? So, for example, let's take a Innova Sidewinder. That is a fairway driver that is understable. If you throw that, normal wind conditions, there's really no wind, and this disc gives you a nice S-curve. When you throw it into a headwind, instead of curving back to the left, if you're right-handed, what's going to happen is it's just going to continue to flip over, and if you're lucky, it's going to just turn and hold a rightward angle. If you're unlucky, it's going to completely flip the disc over and it's going to become some sort of a roller and you're not going to be very happy with your shot 9 times out of 10. So the reason that you want to throw in more overstable disc is because it's fighting against the wind. It has a better opportunity to hold that hyzer line and cut through the wind because you're throwing into it. And something that I think is really critical here is you don't want to throw 100% power when you're throwing into a headwind. I feel like trying to throw 100% power into that headwind is only going to cause you to turn your disc over more and you're going to get a bad shot. I think you're almost better accepting that it's a headwind and throwing something that is a higher speed, more overstable disc. So you might be thinking, Q, what are some good discs that I can throw for that? The Firebird, the Felon, the Raptor, the Onyx, those are some fairway driver-ish options for you. And then stepping up further into the distance drivers, you have your DD3s, your Zeuses, Destroyer, Raider. You've got so many different options when it comes to disc selection, but you want to throw overstable, higher speed discs. If you take a Buzz, for example, and you try to throw it into a headwind, it's probably going to flip up and go to the right unless you're throwing with a ton of hyzer. So, to recap, if you're throwing into a tailwind, you want to throw your understable discs. If you're throwing into a headwind, you want to throw overstable discs. Now, you might be thinking, what happens if I have a crosswind? That's a fantastic question. It depends which way the wind is going. If you have a wind that is moving left to right, you want to throw something that is overstable. Because if
right hand, backhand.
Yes, everything is right hand, backhand. If you're a lefty, RIP. Love you, but
just
RIP,
flip it.
my
Flip everything we're saying if you're a lefty.
It's like Tua Tagovailoa. Just flip everything, right? Get those 6 touchdowns, baby. So when you have that left to right wind, you want to throw an overstable disc because your disc is fighting against the wind and you're going to be able to hold a more straight line with a little bit of leftward finish. Again, let's go back to that Sidewinder example. If you throw an end of a Sidewinder into a left to right wind, you can put a ton of hyzer on it and hope that it holds its angle and holds its line and the wind is just moving it to the rightward exactly how you want. But that's probably not what's going to happen. Probably what's going to happen is the wind is going to catch it, and it's going to flip the disc over, and then you're never going to get out of it, and you're going to finish in a roller position, or you're going to finish way off your intended target. it's the exact opposite when it's a right to left wind. Because if you're throwing that overstable disc in a right to left wind, it's going to be even more overstable. It's like overstability squared, right? You're going to have that Raider is now, instead of going 200 feet before it hooks left, it's going to go like 150 feet before it hooks left. You're going to get less distance, and you're going to get the disc to go more left. Maybe that's exactly what you need. Maybe the hole is shaped to where it's like a 269-foot hyzer all the way, and you've got a right to left wind. Cool. You can still throw something that's overstable, but if you have that right to left wind, you want to throw something more understable to neutral, so that way you can continue to ride that straight line, maybe get a little bit of movement to the right before it comes back to the left, but you're not going to see the dramatic effects of moving the disc fully to the left when you're throwing an understable disc into a right to left wind. So those are how you're going to get off the tee. So those are the two tips. That's how you can attack the wind getting off of the tee. So now, Trent, explain to me, we're off the tee. We've now got, 150 and in to get to the basket. What is your tip when playing in these heavy wind conditions to make sure you're able to secure that par or that birdie if it's a par 4?
Yep, I got you. So on the upshot, especially the example of 150 feet in, it's not going to matter so much what type of disc you select. Yes, the similar attributes that Quentin just explained for overstable, understable, right to left, all those are kind of going to affect, but the main thing you want to think about on your up shots and your approach shots in these windy conditions is the wind direction and how you are going to throw the disc. Let's say you have a right to left crosswind and you need to throw something straight. Take the same disc you always throw. So say, for example, you throw a zone, a harp, an A2, whatever your approach disc might be, your normal approach disc, you're going to want to focus on getting the flight plate, so the bottom of the disc, opposite of the direction of the wind. So if you have a right to left crosswind and you need to go 150 feet, the main thing you're going to want to do is release the disc on a little bit of an anhyzer, because it's going to push the disc, just similar to how Quentin explained. It's going to push the disc straight, and it's not going to catch a flight plate. Now, if you were to release it on a hyzer and you want to go straight, it's no matter what the disc is, zone, an understable approach disc, like if you're using a putter or something, if you throw it on a hyzer and there's a right to left cross, it's going to catch that flight plate and it's going to push it way off target. So the main thing you're going to want to focus on is the direction of the wind. You want to make sure the wind does not get under the disc to lift the disc, push the disc off track. So you might have to work on a little bit more of your forehands just to keep the wind on top of the disc rather than trying to throw ante. If you can't throw ante, practice your forehand so you can get the wind on top of the disc. That is going to be my main tip on approach shots in windy conditions.
And I think to couple that, something that's really, really important is setting up your next shot, right? When you're at that approach and you're not really going for the basket at all, you have to think, how can I put this in my comfort circle? How can I land this in that little zone that's going to make me very happy to be putting from? So that could be 10 feet. Let's say 10 feet all the way around the basket. That's where you want to land. Great. 20 feet, great. 30 feet, you're a god. Whatever it is, okay? But you now need to consider the windy conditions. If you have a headwind and you don't like putting into headwinds, you need to throw past the basket. You need to put more on your shot so that way it goes beyond the basket and you're now putting with a tailwind. Vice versa. Maybe you hate putting with tailwinds. Don't throw it past the basket. Throw it in front of the basket so that way you can putt into the headwind. You have a crosswind. Either direction, same thing. You need to think about, what is the wind doing for me 5 feet in front of me? And what is the wind doing 150 feet in front of me, right? Because let's say you have a right to left wind right there in front of you, but you have a headwind at the basket. You need to understand where you want to land, and by doing so, coupling that with Trenton's tip, you'll be able to put yourself in a landing zone that you're happier with. I personally would rather putt into a tailwind. So I would rather have a 20-foot tailwind putt than a 15-foot headwind putt. Because when you're putting in those very windy conditions, it gets a lot more nerve-wracking. We'll talk about our tips there in 1 second. So, for me, what that looks like I've kind of explained a little bit, is that if I want that tailwind, I'm putting my disc wherever the basket is. So maybe it's 10 feet to the left of the basket. That gives me the optimal tailwind. That gives me exactly what I want. That's where I'm aiming at. You're not aiming to throw it in. You're aiming for a landing zone. That landing zone is critical to you making the putt, which leads us to talking about how to make the putt in these windy conditions. So Trent, what is your tip for making sure you're getting those birdies out there on those windy days?
All right, what I have to say for putting into any kind of wind like we've been talking about is do not be afraid to use something other than your putter because of the stability. It will help you push a little bit straighter. The same things that we've been talking about, not letting the wind get under the flight plate, getting in a position to where you're comfortable to putt. So if you like to putt with a tailwind, if you like to putt with a headwind, if you like to putt with a crosswind, more power to you. Those are tough. But don't be afraid to, if you always putt with an EMAC judge, do not be afraid to putt with your approach disc into a severe headwind because it will not float as much. It wants to get down quicker. That will help you. The other tip I have is to take your medicine sometimes. This is going to be a 2-for-1 from me. Take your medicine. If you are on edge of circle and you have a ridiculous wind and you're not feeling good about it, don't run it, because what's going to happen is it's going to catch wind. It's going to catch the flight plate. You're going to have the exact same putt from another spot. Take your medicine. You can even flip the disc over. It won't glide hardly at all if you flip it over onto its top. So what I'm saying is literally flip it over, putt it. It will just plop straight down. And take your medicine if you have to, and just take the par. And if you have to take a bogey, take a bogey, because I guarantee you in high wind conditions, your opponents or the people you're playing with are going to have those same issues, and they're going to take strokes where they shouldn't be taking strokes.
I mean, that's a fantastic thing to bring up, right? Let's take that circle 2 putt, that 35-footer that you're typically always running. In heavy wind conditions, it might be better to lay that up to 5 feet and move on. Maybe that means you get a bogey, but then at least you're saving yourself from a double bogey, triple bogey, because the worst thing that can happen to you is your disc hits, let's say that you either airball or the disc hits the top of the basket and shoots another 30 feet in the other direction. And so now, let's say you had that 35-footer in a tailwind, you're happy. Well, now all of a sudden you have a 30-footer in a headwind, and you're probably going to miss that because you're a little rattled now. So I think that's a fantastic tip. And, if you follow the Pro Tour, I remember when Kevin Jones was, I can't think of the tournament right now, but he was leading the tournament and then just kept getting absolutely wrecked on this hole that had a little bit of an incline next to the basket, and it was high wind conditions, and he kept missing and then rolling and going out of bounds, and I think he took like a 10 or something like that and was completely out of the tournament after that. So it's one of those things where it sucks. It really, really, really sucks. But sometimes it's better to give up that birdie opportunity and to save a par. Because I remember earlier this year when we were playing in a tournament that had 30-plus mile-per-hour winds, there were not a lot of people getting birdies out there. So when you get a par, really, you are getting a birdie. So it's one of those things that I really think it sucks. Swallow the pill, put some peanut butter on it, and take those pars, take those bogeys, get out of there safe, move on to the next hole, because other people will make mistakes because they are not listening to this podcast. They are not subscribed to this podcast, so you are already getting an advantage over those people by being subscribed to this podcast and not missing the weekly tips and tricks coming from this show. My tip on putting is you hear a lot of people talking about you need to change your aiming point. And initially, I always thought that needed to be a big, drastic change. So let's lay the foundation here. When you are putting and there's wind involved, a headwind is going to raise your disc, a tailwind is going to lower your disc, and then obviously the crosswind, depending on left or right, is going to move your disc in that direction. So I heard this tip, but never really understood it fully when I was just getting started playing disc golf. You have your aiming point. If you're using disc dot, Hashtag code Chain Clankers, save yourself 10% and support the show. Helps your putting a lot. If you're using your disc dot and you have your aiming point, if you're putting into a headwind, that doesn't mean you're aiming at the cage and hoping it lifts it into the basket. Maybe if you're like 45, 50 deep in circle 2, you can aim that low and hope something like that happens. But if you're looking at a 20-footer, you changing your aiming point by half of the chains is probably going to lead to you missing a lot of putts. Same thing if you're putting into a tailwind, because a tailwind is going to lower your disc. So if you're putting at the band, hoping that it's going to fall into the basket, you're probably making a bad bet. And more times than not, you're probably going to doink off the band. So what you really should be doing is just changing your aiming point slightly. You should be moving your aiming point up or down within 2 to 3 chain links of your original aiming point. And you can use the same thing for those crosswinds, right? So if you have a wind that is going right to left and you aim directly at the pole, you now need to aim 2 to 3 chain links to the right, so that way it will push it right into the pole. If you aim outside of the basket entirely, you're probably going to miss that putt. This is a hot take out there for some, but maybe you should always keep your putter inside the chains. And what I say is your aiming point should never leave the width of the basket. So if your aiming point is the band or the cage or outside of the physical chains left or right, you're killing your ability to make putts because you have a less than ideal aiming point. So again, it's marginal changes to your aiming point, 2 to 3 chain links. The other thing, and I know this is terrifying for me, and this is terrifying for a lot of other people. You have to putt with confidence, and you have to putt hard when you're putting into the wind. If you have a 25, 30 mile per hour headwind, and you try to lollygag and soft toss your putter into the basket, the wind is going to absolutely annihilate it. Because think about it, right? If you're throwing something with less weight, not as hard, into a windy condition, the wind is going to affect that object more than if you're throwing it harder into the wind. The harder you're throwing it, the more likelihood it's going to stay on its original plane and the wind will not affect the disc. So it's terrifying, but you actually need to putt literally the exact same, if not harder, into the wind. When you get scared and get tense and lose your confidence, that's when you're going to see yourself missing more putts into the wind.
I agree. And a lot of the times putting harder really just means putting more spin on the disc. So don't literally try to throw it 400 feet. Just try to get a little bit of extra pop out of your hand when you release it. That's all it really takes, in my opinion, in putting in the wind. When he says putting harder, is just trying to get a little bit more spin on it than your normal putt.
Exactly. So to recap, we've got the 3 tips on driving and approach shots and putting. So Trent, if you were to go out and you were playing a round in 0 to 10 mile per hour wind, 10 to 20 mile per hour wind, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, when do you actually start to see real changes in how disc golf is played?
I would say at 10 mile per hour and above, you start to see changes in how disc golf is played. I mean, you might not be grabbing the most overstable disc off the tee in 10 to 20, but you're going to grab a more overstable disc than you normally throw into a headwind, and you're going to grab an understable disc with a tailwind, kind of like we talked about. When you get up even higher, just the more overstable, the higher speed you need in your bag to handle those conditions. So if you're playing in a 30, 40 mile an hour wind and you have a 13 speed, I don't even know a 13 speed disc. If you have a 13 speed disc laying around and you know you're going to go play, I say put it in your bag, because that thing is probably going to be a workhorse for you in those insane conditions. But 10 mile an hour can cause a disc to move incredibly. Like you said, we get used to playing in 10 mile an hour winds, and then when it's 2 to 4, we're like, we don't even know what's going on because, well, we know what's going on, but it's crazy how big of a difference just that even 5-6 mile an hour can make on the plastic when it's flying.
Exactly. So the next time that you go out to the course, make sure you do a quick look at what are the conditions. How much wind is there going to be? Maybe you need to alter your bag a little bit depending on if you know that your local course is typically, when it's windy, it's going to be a headwind somehow on every single hole. That's how I feel like it is here in Wichita a lot, is somehow every single hole I play, there's a headwind. So maybe you need to make sure you have more overstable discs in your bag. Take out some of those understable ones. Not all of them, just some of them. Maybe some of your neutral ones. And load up, be ready to attack the course. And just know that each one of those increments that I said, you're going to see more and more changes. You're going to see discs flying differently. And something that's really important that I want to hit home before we leave is understanding that if you expose the flight plate of the disc, that's the underneath side of the disc, to the wind is going to take your disc and it is going to throw it in whatever directions it goes. So let's say you throw a forehand skip shot. If you're throwing that shot as a right-handed player and it skips high and there's a crosswind left to right, it is going to shoot that disc to the right way further than you anticipated. So you always want to have those things in mind. You want to have these tips in mind. And if you want to continue to improve your disc golf game and you want to beat your friends, you want to play better at tournaments, you just want to learn about disc golf, make sure you hit the subscribe button right now so you never miss another video or podcast from us. We've got new podcasts every single Monday, and we are here to help you get better at disc golf. And if you want to support us, you can head over to our Patreon, patreon.com/Chain Clankers. We've got our 4th episode of Beyond the Chains, our extra bonus podcast coming up this week. We have an interesting discussion this week. I'm excited to get into this. There's a prominent disc golfer that says winning the World Championship really doesn't mean you're the best disc golfer out there. So we're going to debate that and a little bit more over there on our Patreon. It just takes $5 to join, and it helps support this podcast.
Thanks to all you guys out there supporting us, and don't forget to check us out on Facebook, Instagram. Facebook, Instagram are the main spots. Come chit-chat with us. Come give us your opinion. We're asking for input all the time. And
like, comment, subscribe.
Like,
bye-bye
comment,
now.
subscribe. Bye-bye.
We'll see you guys next week.